Hey, Darren.
Hi, Dom. How are you doing?
Great, great. How are you?
Good.
Nice to have you here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm actually excited to get you here because you have the kind of expertise that my listeners have been asking for, especially when it comes to delicate subjects that seem like we just hear them on the radio, but they might actually affect our lives.
Yeah, a lot of this topic that we're going to talk about has many reaching aspects for all kinds of industries.
Yeah. So today we're talking about the USMCA, which is the United States, Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement. It's replacing NAFTA.
Correct.
And how that's going to affect the Canadian woodworking industry. So the finished wood trades is who we talk to here: cabinet makers, architectural millworkers, people that do a kitchen cabinet. They might be dealers. They could be making windows and doors. Anything in finished wood trades is really who listens to this show. And moreover, something you're very familiar with is there people who are the owners of those companies.
Right. And, we're primarily advisors to the small, medium, well, even approaching on the larger size clients, non-big audit clients, but the privately owned growing businesses, often of which are doing business cross-border. That's sort of our sweet spot, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's how you and I met. I suppose we should tell our listeners who you are and what you do, but I met you because I have clients who do business both in Canada and the United States, and there's nuances there for taxation and duties and things like that, and you're an expert at that. So I thought, what a better person to call on the line. So let's do this. Darren, who are you, and what the heck are you doing here?
I'm here because of my relationship with you, Dom, through Entrepreneurs Organization, which is where we met. I'm the founder and CEO of Facet Advisors. We're based in Langley, but our client base is, all over the place. North America, we have some clients in Europe. So really, geographically, we're not limited. We're, strictly speaking, we're a traditional, chartered accountancy firm that does the bookkeeping and accounting and stuff. But really, our sweet spot is planning, tax planning. I've been a tax specialist since 1993. I'm a licensed CPA in the U.S., which is something I did out of frustration because a lot of our clients were doing business cross-border. They were going to seek advice from a U.S.-only advisor who didn't care about what happened in Canada. So there wasn't a maximization of the cross-border structure.
Right.
And so I got the CPA, and that's really helped our clients because we're able to advise them on a cross-border basis.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, the clever people that I know all use you as their accountant. So you're not just an accountant. You're the accountant that clever business owners use that they're looking. And I think it's because you have that cross-border experience.
Well, I think so. And I am also an entrepreneur myself, right? Like I said, we met through Entrepreneurs Organization. I started this firm. I own my building. I'm not just an advisor. I'm an entrepreneur at heart. So I get entrepreneurs.
Right. I'm trying to turn off this alarm that you hear going. Sorry about that.
I think that's mine.
So let's talk about this free trade. It used to be called NAFTA.
Yeah. So NAFTA didn't have an expiry date. And that's really where Trump came along and said, I want to renegotiate this. I don't want it to be an indefinite agreement. And he put some strict timelines in place. And it got signed, hours before the deadline that he had imposed. And Canada, kind of the last to the table. And now, really, it does expire, or it can be reviewed every 6 years. And if everything's great, then it goes for 16 years, but every 6 years it can be reviewed. If everything's fine every 6 years, it extends for another 16 years. So that's what you'll typically hear is the sunset clause. So they didn't want to go into another agreement that just never expired.
Interesting. So there's a timeline. Does that leave opportunity, or is that a concern, that timeline? I'm speaking about it here for our Canadian listeners into the States, but I guess also for the Americans who are thinking about exporting up to Canada.
I think it's both. I think having the ability to revisit things is good. There'll be changes of government and things like that will allow through this agreement. Which doesn't really take place till 2020, but we're just getting things in place now. But it gives us the ability to revisit them. The other side of it is, of course, the opposite side of that is there's uncertainty. So if I'm budgeting and I've got customers, either a U.S. customer, a U.S. manufacturer with a Canadian customer, or vice versa, and I've got a good thing going and I've done my pricing right, 6 years comes along and everything changes. That there's uncertainty now. So I think it's a good thing and a bad thing. But I think an agreement that never expires is never a good thing. The circumstances change.
Right. So if I'm a Canadian manufacturer and I'm sending goods to the United States, and some of our listeners are doing that, there's a brisk trade. Those that are doing it a lot. Those that aren't doing it at all. But if I wasn't a manufacturer exporter, what are some considerations that I need to pay attention to? What parts of my business is this going to affect?
Well, the main areas that got targeted in this agreement were agriculture, automotive, and there's pharmaceutical and retail. So those are the big sectors. Anybody doing business cross-border should be just as concerned about changes in sales tax in the U.S. as well as what we term nexus, which is having a physical presence in some of those states. So this free trade agreement is important from a duties and taxes point of view, but if you're doing business cross-border, there's just as many other issues that one really needs to be aware of, and sales tax and state tax are a huge part of it, because while we have a Canada-US free trade agreement, the US states aren't bound by that. So there's some states that follow the treaty and some don't. So whenever we have any clients that are doing business cross-border, either inbound or outbound, and there's concerns for US companies too, because we have a myriad of rules as well. We've got a number of boxes that we have to address before we can say we've addressed everything that you need to be cognizant of.
If you probably have stories along these lines, and of course confidentiality is front of mind, but do you have an example of a company that was doing business in Canada then decided to start doing business in the US and maybe got caught in some mistakes? And I say caught meaning they missed opportunities, or something significant was uncovered that you helped them to find.
You're talking about a U.S. company that's come to Canada, and
either way, if you got a good story that tells us, hey, I want the listeners to understand I might look like that and I might have that situation. Here's how to get around.
I think a big concern for Canadian companies that are even if you just don't even have a permanent establishment in the U.S., but you have U.S. customers. We had a horror story where they got caught by California, and California has an economic nexus test. So if I'm here in Langley giving my tax advice to customers in California, and my revenues from those customers either exceed $500,000 US or 25% of my total revenue, I'm deemed to have a permanent establishment in California.
Really?
And I have to file a California tax return. So I could go to the Canada-US federal tax treaty and say, no, under the treaty I'm exempt because I'm sitting in Langley, I don't have any employees, I don't have an office. But this term of economic nexus can catch people even without a physical presence. I never even need to step into the US to be caught by this. And so there's certain states, California, New York are typical ones where we really have to be careful in advising our clients that just because you're here doesn't mean you're exempt from US tax. Now, if a client does get caught with that California tax, in my example, we can claim that against the Canadian tax, and chances are they aren't going to get double taxed. But there's a compliance burden, and maybe this doesn't get caught for 3 years, and by the time it gets caught, California's racked up three years of arrear interest. So once we know where clients are doing business, we sort of make them aware of state tax, and of course another big issue is sales tax for your customers are. We have the same issue coming the other way, where a client may be just sending staff up here to supervise an installation. So they've manufactured the equipment in the States, Canadian customer, they come and the staff is just overseeing the installation, but they're here and they're traveling back and forth, and some of the revenue from the contract is allocatable to the oversight, either an engineer overseeing the professional installation. And so we can run into problems where Canada has deemed them to have a permanent establishment here. And then There's GST issues.
Yeah.
There's lots of things to advise on the inbound as well. And if a Canadian company pays a non-resident for services rendered in Canada, there's withholding issues. The U.S. company can file those tax returns to get that withholding tax back, but it has to sort of explain what it's been doing to justify the refund. Tax jurisdictions never like to give back withholding tax, whether it be U.S. or Canada. So there is the ability to apply for waivers, where you can say, "Hey, this is my project. I'm a U.S. company. I'm coming into Canada. Here's what I'm doing. It's going to be from this date to this date. I'm sending this employee in, and they're only going to be there a week. And this is X percentage of their revenue. We think we fall below your threshold. Will you grant us an exemption?" And they will say yes or no. The problem with that is you've got to plan so far ahead for that sort of thing. Right. It's often just not practical.
I'm thinking about some of the machinery, because people that serve the industry listen to this podcast as well. So they might be distributors of some very large machinery. I'm thinking about CNC machines and some really complex edge banders and other pieces of specialty equipment for woodwork. If they are on either side of the border and they're sending their specialist technician across the border to do that work, then it's worth a conversation either with you or somebody like you to make sure that they're not caught out, nor is their employee caught out.
Yes. Yeah, because there's two issues here. There's a company. So the company has its own taxation issues, but then there's also the employee, where they could be deemed to have a filing requirement here. And even though the payroll is by the foreign, either the U.S. company on inbound stuff or the Canadian company on outbound stuff, even though that's at the company level, the employee can be caught too. So sometimes we've had to step in and do tax returns for the employees. Often the companies will look after that for them.
Right.
Keep them out of trouble.
Well, that's an additional cost and an additional consideration. And then you also now have a staffer, somebody on your team who's potentially a little bit uncomfortable crossing the border now to do the work that they're on board and trained to do.
Yeah, and if you have a Canadian in the U.S. and suddenly, the IRS is saying you need to file a return, they get pretty stressed about that.
You think? Right?
And you don't want your staff and you don't want your employees stressed about filing obligations that they have nothing to do with. We have one client that showed up at the border. He's in an industry that is under a bit of scrutiny right now. I'm sure we can all guess what that is. And they were barred from entry just because of the industry. And the employees now have an issue.
That they're not able to go across border.
No, I mean, they can apply to have that reversed, but you've got those issues too, depending on what industry you're in.
You can apply to have that reversed, but as you know, the problem exists that moment when you're expected to present at that conference, do that training. Multiple managers are coming into town for a strategic planning session. You've provided the only manager who can't make it to that. That becomes a really big deal. It holds up business operations for companies. Totally.
Yeah. I mean, one person can change everything, right? Yeah. And you organize something, everybody shows up, and the key person's left back at the border. That's a big problem.
That would be an issue. Yeah. That's a lot of stress and strain there. So this is a little bit of trivia, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but I heard that hockey players have to pay taxes in the city or in the state they played in, even if they're based in another place.
Yeah, no, we've done work for NHL players for years, and that's completely true. Sometimes the tax returns are about that thick.
Hold on a second. This is a podcast, so it's an audio and a video. You're holding up. That was about 4 inches there that you were saying.
Yeah. By the time you do the tax returns for all these states, and there's in New York, there's city tax, there's county tax, there's franchise tax returns, and so they allocate them based on days in states. So it's interesting, and they know. I mean, they've got the schedule. They know when the teams fly into town. So you'll often see if a team is coming into a high tax state and they want to minimize days in that state, they'll arrange to fly out before midnight. So the game will end, they'll get the team cleaned up, and they'll get them on the plane, and they'll get out of the state before midnight, so they don't trickle into another day's allocation.
Really?
Yeah, very interesting. They may practice, for some of the states that the travel's not such a big deal, they'll practice at home and then they'll travel to the other state for the game. So there's a fair bit of planning that goes on there, and yeah, we've done enough of it that we've seen it all. And
yeah,
it's
that's just good trivia for all of us to listen to. Those of you who are listening and wondering what this taxation had to do with you, there's a little bit of sports trivia you can share.
Well, it's interesting because Alberta does the same thing. So Alberta nabs the U.S. teams too. So Alberta got smart to that. So it happens on our side too.
Yeah, it goes both ways. So what would your, I know you can't give advice, but what are the things that I should do if I run a business in Canada and I decide that I want to start operations in the States? What are maybe the top 3 things I have to consider, or the top people I need to talk to before I make that move?
Well, I think, certainly if you have employees crossing the border, you've got to talk to an immigration lawyer. You've got to know what they can and can't. That's critical because, like we just said, a few minutes ago, you get your employees barred, or you have problems with them. I mean, we all know our employees are our best resource, they're gold. So you can't risk that. The second thing is to get a really good understanding of what our business cross-border looks like, what the liabilities may be, the exposure cross-border, make sure the structure's right. So, if I'm just selling into the U.S. using my previous example, everything's here. I just have U.S. customers. Then we need to be cognizant of that economic nexus I talked about, where states can nab you on sales. You need to be cognizant of sales tax. There's just a recent decision, a North Dakota Supreme Court decision called Wayfair. Wayfair is an online retailer. That course has just redefined the collection of sales tax in states. That's something to be really cognizant of. And once you kind of have an understanding of that, you say, okay, well, based on this, here's my liability risk. No, I'm fine operating from Canada. I can have this employee down there. I'm not caught by economic nexus. I'm just soliciting sales. I'm pretty good. I might need to file a U.S. tax return just to say, hey, I'm doing things in the States, but under the treaty, it's not amounting to doing business, but I'm disclosing it so that I'm safe, because there's penalties for non-disclosure. But if you're shipping goods across the border and it's more than just storing them in a third-party warehouse, shipping goods, titles passing in Canada, moving them to the States, you really need to look at potentially a U.S. subsidiary and structuring things right that way. And then, of course, that then leads to a myriad of other things. So I've got a subsidiary, I've got cross-border reporting. There's something called transfer pricing, which is the value that the Canadian company and the U.S. company transact at, because that has to mirror arm's length pricing.
Oh, right. You can't be giving deals.
Because if you think about it, if I know, if I know that, this isn't necessarily true, but if I knew that the U.S. had, and well, it is actually kind of true, because the U.S. has just dropped its tax rate to 21% for corporations. So if I know the tax rate in the U.S. is 21 and it's 30 here, I'm going to be predisposed to wanting to leave more profit in the U.S., or potentially predisposed. You've still got to look at what that looks like on a flow-through basis back to the Canadian parent. But you can't just do that, because both jurisdictions want their fair share.
Right.
So they say you need to document your transactions under a transfer pricing report, or be subject to pretty serious penalties and interest. So it's not just a matter of saying, well, I pick a low tax jurisdiction and I'm going to park my profits there. You have to make sure that your structure is optimized, both for liability and taxation.
Wow. So that's a lot more than, hey, I see an opportunity, let's go for it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. One of the first questions I ask a new client that comes in is, where are your customers? Where are your customers? Where's your product moving? Where's it changing title? Because that has a lot to do with it too, right?
Right. If you're straight on board in Canada, or if it changes title.
Yeah. If I'm a manufacturing facility in Abbotsford and I'm FOB, which is where title passes in Abbotsford, then it's the customer that's really importing the goods, not me. But if I'm FOB blank, I now have inventory that's passing title in the U.S. That's got implications to it.
Does it ever? I think that's a very important point for our listeners to think of. Even if you're not considering doing business in the States right now, where that title, where the ownership of your product changes from yours to theirs is always an important consideration.
Absolutely. And I mean, this has got nothing to do with tax, but then there's also the insurance, like who's responsible for it till it gets to the end point, right? Because that can be devastating for either the customer or the seller if that's not addressed and something happens between the warehouse and the customer.
So far you've talked about two different kinds of professionals that I'd probably need to talk to if I was seriously considering doing cross-border trade. One is an immigration lawyer, and the other is I suppose a financial person, somebody like you. So is that correct for the?
And it doesn't need to be, one person necessarily. Like if they have a Canadian advisor, they just need to make sure that if they're talking to a U.S. advisor that they know the tax treaty and they know our tax system, and the two of them are having a conversation that's collaborative and aimed at making sure the customer's looked after. It can be one person. There's other people like me out there that know both sides of the border and have done enough of this stuff that they kind of know where the potholes are. But it doesn't have to be one person. One of the problems we've had in the past is we've seen Canadians, they want to do business in the U.S., they cross the border, they talk to a lawyer. The lawyer puts them into an LLC, which is a limited liability corporation, which is a corporation for U.S. tax purposes, but the income flows through to the ultimate shareholder. So it's almost like a partnership here. Under the Canada-US tax treaty, LLCs are not recognized. So a lot of the preferential treatment that happens under our tax treaty isn't available in an LLC. And that's one of the things that led me to getting my CPA in the US was I got tired of seeing clients put into the wrong structure that we had to unwind. So, there are cross-border structures that work. You just have to make sure that that they work on both sides of the border. And often, it could be a Canadian ignoring the US side, or it could be a US advisor ignoring the Canadian side, because they're so used to just dealing in their own jurisdiction that we see structures all the time that are set up wrong, and it's costly to fix them.
Yeah, well, just the time that it takes to sit down and deal with this takes an owner away from the operations of the business, which is costly in itself. Can you imagine taking 2 or 3 days out of your already busy schedule just to deal with paperwork? How frustrating that would be.
Yeah, well, and time is just one part of it. Like some of this stuff you just can't unwind, right, without a huge tax consequence. So
it gets worse. You mean it gets worse?
Yeah, exactly.
So Darren, if people want to get in touch with you and find out more about this, because there are people out there that have in their mind growth plans or expansion plans that include U.S. locations or cross-border trade. And for my American listeners, they're thinking about doing things in Canada as well. How does somebody get in touch with you and find out more?
You know what? They can go to our website. It's www.facetadvisors.com/news. And then they could sign up for our newsletter, and we post things that are topical like we're talking about right now, or just facetadvisors.com, contact us. There's a contact page there. We like to share information. We like to share, like we've talked about today, some practical implications, and happy to help out anybody that might have some questions before they venture out and get in trouble.
Do you tell hockey player taxation stories on there?
Yeah, no names basis.
Well, of course. So it's Facet Advisors. FACET is what I've got from here.
Advisors, all one word, .com/news. That's for our newsletter. We're gonna keep pace with this trade agreement, because a lot of it doesn't come into place until 2020.
Right.
Things are going to change. Things are going to be clarified. So there'll be updates on our newsletter as this progresses towards 2020.
Okay, great. So for all of you listening, great place to get the information. The newsletter, I don't know how often you put it out there, but it's going to be valuable info. And really, the way of the world now is that information is what drives wealth and opportunity. It's not being caught by surprise and playing catch up. It's being proactive and staying ahead of the game on these things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Darren, thank you so much for coming with us. You're part of a series that I hope to do here. You're the Canadian perspective on the USMCA. As you might imagine, I'm going to get an American perspective on the USMCA, and I'm also going to get a Mexican perspective on the USMCA. And I'm pretty sure all countries call it something different, but we're going to talk about this new deal.
Well, I can help you out with that because our international affiliation, we have firms in the US and Mexico that specialize in this. So if you need a speaker, give me a shout.
See, that's the beauty of getting out there and reaching out and making connections with people. Thanks, Darren. I'll do that for sure.
All right.
All right. Thanks very much for joining us here, Darren. Hopefully we will talk to you soon.
Okay. Thanks, Dom. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye-bye.